Pray who is there who would refuse to bearer be of happy news? Snow covered the Green Meadows and the Green Forest, and ice bound the Smiling Pool and the Laughing Brook. Reddy and Granny Fox were hungry most of the time. It was not easy to find enough to eat these days, and so they spent nearly every minute they were awake in hunting. Sometimes they hunted together, but usually one went one way and the other went another way, so as to have a greater chance of finding something. If either found enough for two, the other, finding it, took the food back to their home if it could be carried. If not, the other was told where to find it. For several days they had had very little to eat, and they were so hungry that they were willing to take almost any chance to get a good meal. For 2 nights they had visited Farmer Brown's henhouse, hoping that they would be able to find a way inside. But the biddies had been securely locked up, and try as they would, they couldn't find a way in. "It's of no use," said Granny as they started back home after the second try, "to hope to get one of those hens at night. If we are going to get any at all, we will have to do it in broad daylight. It can be done, for I have done it before, but I don't like the idea. We are likely to be seen, and that means that Bowser the Hound will be set to hunting us." "Pooh!" exclaimed Reddy. "What of it? It's easy enough to fool him." "You think so, do you?" snapped Granny. "I never yet saw a young fox who didn't think he knew all there is to know, and you're just like the rest. When you've lived as long as I have, you will have learned not to be quite so sure of your opinions. I grant you that when there is no snow on the ground, any fox with a reasonable amount of fox sense in his head can fool Bowser. But with snow everywhere, it is a very different matter. If Bowser once takes it into his head to follow your trail these days, you will have to be smarter than I think you are to fool him. The only way you will be able to get away from him will be by going into a hole in the ground. And when you do that, you will have given away a secret that will mean we will never have any peace at all. We will never know when Farmer Brown's boy will take it into his head to smoke us out. I've seen it done. No, sir, we are not going to try for one of those hens in the daytime unless we are starving." "I'm starving now," whined Reddy. "No such thing," Granny snapped. "I've been without food longer than this many a time. Have you been over to the Big River lately?" "No," replied Reddy. "What's the use? It's frozen over. There isn't anything there." "Perhaps not," replied Granny. "But I had learned a long time ago that it is a poor plan to overlook any chance. There is a place in the Big River which never freezes because the water runs too swiftly to freeze, and I've found more than one meal washed ashore there. You go over there now while I see what I can find in the Green Forest. If neither of us finds anything, it will be time enough to think about Farmer Brown's hens tomorrow." Much against his will, Reddy obeyed. "It isn't the least bit of use," he grumbled as he trotted towards the Big River. "There won't be anything there. It is just a waste of time." Late that afternoon he came hurrying back, and Granny knew by the way that he cocked his ears and carried his tail that he had news of some kind. "Well, what is it?" she demanded. "I found a dead fish that had washed ashore," replied Reddy. "It wasn't big enough for two, so I ate it." "Anything else?" asked Granny. "No," replied Reddy slowly. "That is, nothing that will do us any good. Quacker the Wild Duck was swimming about out in the open water, but though I watched and watched, he never once came ashore." "Ha!" exclaimed Granny. "That is good news. I think we'll go duck hunting." When you're in doubt what course is right, the thing to do is just sit tight. Jolly, round, bright Mr. Sun had just got well started on his daily climb up in the blue, blue sky that morning when he spied 2 figures trotting across the snow-covered Green Meadows, one behind the other. They were trotting along quite as if they had made up their minds just where they were going. They had. You see, they were Granny and Reddy Fox, and they were bound for the big river at the place where the water ran too swiftly to freeze. The day before, Reddy had discovered Quacker the Wild Duck swimming about there, and now they were on their way to try to catch him. Granny led the way, and Reddy meekly followed her. To tell the truth, Reddy hadn't the least idea that they would have a chance to catch Quacker, because Quacker kept out in the water where he was as safe from them as if they were 1,000 miles away. The only reason that Reddy had willingly started with Granny was the hope that he might find a dead fish washed up on the shore, as he had the day before. "Granny certainly is growing foolish in her old age," thought Reddy as he trotted along behind her. "I told her that Quacker never once came ashore, all the time I watched yesterday. I don't believe he ever comes ashore, and if she knows anything at all, she ought to know that she can't catch him out there in the water. Granny used to be smart enough when she was young, I guess, but she certainly is losing her mind now. It's a pity, a great pity. I can just imagine how Quacker will laugh at her. I have to laugh myself." He did laugh, but you may be sure he took great pains that Granny should not see him laughing. Whenever she looked around, he was as sober as could be. In fact, he appeared to be quite as eager as if he felt sure they would catch Quacker. Now, old Granny Fox is very wise in the ways of the Great World, and if Reddy could have known what was going on in her mind as she led the way to the Big River, he might not have felt quite so sure of his own smartness. Granny was doing some quiet laughing herself. "He thinks I'm old and foolish and don't know what I'm about, the young scamp," thought she. "He thinks he has learned all there is to learn. It isn't the least use in the world to try to tell him anything. When young folks feel the way he does, it is a waste of time to talk to them. He has got to be shown. There is nothing like experience to take the conceit out of these youngsters." Now, conceit is the feeling that you know more than anyone else. Perhaps you do. Then again, perhaps you don't. So sometimes it is best not to be too sure of your own opinion. Reddy was sure. He trotted along behind old Granny Fox and planned smart things to say to her when she found that there wasn't a chance to catch Quacker the Duck. I am afraid, very much afraid, that Reddy was planning to be saucy. People who think themselves smart are quite apt to be saucy. Presently they came to the bank of the Big River. Old Granny Fox told Reddy to sit still while she crept up behind some bushes where she could peek out over the Big River. He grinned as he watched her. He was still grinning when she tiptoed back. He expected to see her face long with disappointment. Instead, she looked very much pleased. "Quacker is there," said she, "and I think he will make us a very good dinner. Creep up behind those bushes and see for yourself. Then come back here and tell me what you think we'd better do to get him." So Reddy stole up behind the bushes, and this time it was Granny who grinned as she watched. As he crept along, Reddy wondered if it could be that for once Quacker had come ashore. Granny seemed so sure they could catch him that this must be the case. But when he peeped through the bushes, there was Quacker way out in the middle of the open water, just where he had been the day before. Perhaps 'tis just as well that we can't see ourselves as others see. "Just as I thought," muttered Reddy Fox as he peeped through the bushes on the bank of the Big River and saw Quacker swimming about in the water where it ran too swiftly to freeze. "We've got as much a chance of catching him as I have of jumping over the moon. That's what I'll tell Granny." He crept back carefully so as not to be seen by Quacker, and when he had reached the place where Granny was waiting for him, his face wore a very impudent look. "Well," said Granny Fox, "what shall we do to catch him?" "Learn to swim like a fish and fly like a bird?" replied Reddy in such a saucy tone that Granny had hard work to keep from boxing his ears. "You mean you think he can't be caught?" said she quietly. "I don't think anything about it. I know he can't," snapped Reddy. "Not by us, anyway," he added. "I suppose you wouldn't even try," retorted Granny. "I'm old enough to know when I'm wasting my time," replied Reddy with a toss of his head. "In other words, you think I'm a silly old fox who has lost her senses," said Granny sharply. No, I didn't say that," protested Reddy, looking very uncomfortable. "But you think it," declared Granny. "Now look here, Mr. Smarty, you do just as I tell you. You creep back there where you can watch Quacker and all that happens, and mind that you keep out of his sight. Now go." Reddy went. There was nothing else to do. He didn't dare disobey. Granny watched until Reddy had readied his hiding place. Then what do you think she did? Why, she walked right out on the little beach just below Reddy and in plain sight of Quacker. Yes, sir, that is what she did. Then began such a queer performance that it is no wonder that Reddy was sure Granny had lost her senses. She rolled over and over. She chased her tail round and round until it made Reddy dizzy to watch her. She jumped in the air. She raced back and forth. She played with a bit of stick. And all the time she didn't pay the least attention to Quacker the Duck. Reddy stared and stared. Whatever had come over Granny? She was crazy. Yes, sir, that must be the matter. It must be that she had gone without food so long that she had gone crazy. Poor Granny! She was in her second childhood. Reddy could remember how he had done such things when he was very young, just by way of showing how fine he felt. But for a grown-up fox to do such things was undignified, to say the least. You know, Reddy thinks a great deal of dignity. It was worse than undignified. It was positively disgraceful. He did hope that none of his neighbors would happen along and see Granny cutting up. He never would hear the end of it if they did. Over and over rolled Granny, and around she chased her tail. The snow flew up in a cloud, and all the time she made no sound. Reddy was just trying to decide whether to go off and leave her until she had regained her common sense, or to go out and try to stop her, when he happened to look out in the open water where Quacker was. Quacker was sitting up as straight as he could. In fact, he had his wings raised to help him sit up on his tail, the better to see what old Granny Fox was doing. "As I live," muttered Reddy, "I believe that fellow is nearer than he was." Reddy crouched lower than ever, and instead of watching Granny, he watched Quacker the Duck. The most curious thing in the world is curiosity. Old Granny Fox never said a truer thing than that. It is curious, very curious, how sometimes curiosity will get the best of even the wisest and most sensible of people. Even old Granny Fox herself has been known to be led into trouble by it. We expect it of Peter Rabbit, but Peter isn't a bit more curious than some others of whom we do not expect it. Now, Quacker the Wild Duck is the last one in the world you would expect to be led into trouble by curiosity. Quacker had spent the summer in the far north with Honker the Goose. In fact, he had been born there. He had started for the faraway Southland at the same time Honker had, but when he reached the Big River, he had found plenty to eat and had decided to stay until he had to move on. The Big River had frozen over everywhere except in this one place where the water was too swift to freeze, and there Quacker had remained. You see, he was a good diver, and on the bottom of the river he found plenty to eat. No one could get at him out there unless it was Roughleg the Hawk, and if Roughleg did happen along, all he had to do was to dive and come up far away to laugh and make fun of Roughleg. The water couldn't get through his oily feathers, so he didn't mind how cold it was. Now, in his home in the far north, there were so many dangers that Quacker had learned early to be always on the watch and to take the best care of himself. On his way down to the big river, he had been hunted by men with terrible guns, and he had learned all about them. In fact, he felt quite able to keep out of harm's way. He rather prided himself that there was no one smart enough to catch him. I suspect he thought he knew all there was to know. In this respect, he was a good deal like Reddy Fox himself. That was because he was young. It is the way with young ducks and foxes, and with some other youngsters I know. When Quacker first saw Granny Fox on the little beach, he flirted his absurd little tail and smiled as he thought how she must wish she could catch him. But so far as he could see, Granny didn't once look at him. "She doesn't know I'm out here at all," thought Quacker. Then suddenly he sat up very straight and looked with all his might. What under the sun was the matter with that fox? She was acting as if she had suddenly lost her senses. Over and over she rolled. Around and around she spun. She turned somersaults. She lay on her back and kicked her heels in the air. Never in his life had he known anyone to act like that. There must be something the matter with her. Quacker began to get excited. He couldn't keep his eyes off old Granny Fox. He began to swim nearer. He wanted to see better. He quite forgot she was a fox. She moved so fast that she was just a queer red spot on the beach. Whatever she was doing was very curious and very exciting. He swam nearer and nearer. The excitement was catching. He began to swim in circles himself. All the time he drew nearer and nearer to the shore. He didn't have the least bit of fear. He was just curious. He wanted to see better. All the time Granny was cutting up her antics, she was watching Quacker, though he didn't suspect it. As he swam nearer and nearer to the shore, Granny rolled and tumbled farther and farther back. At last, Quacker was close to the shore. If he kept on, he would be right on the land in a few minutes. And all the time he stared and stared. No thought of danger entered his head. You see, there was no room because it was so filled with curiosity. "In a minute more I'll have him," thought Granny, and whirled faster than ever. And just then something happened. Yes, sir, a chicken track is good to see, but it often puts nothing but water in my mouth. Reddy Fox thought of that saying many times as he hunted through the Green Forest that night, afraid to go home. You see, he had almost dined on Quacker the Duck over at the Big River that day, and then hadn't, and it was all his own fault. That was why he was afraid to go home. From his hiding place on the bank, he had watched Quacker swim in and in until he was almost on the shore, where old Granny Fox was whirling and rolling and tumbling about as if she had entirely lost her senses. Indeed, Reddy had been quite sure that she had when she began. It wasn't until he saw that curiosity was drawing Quacker right in, so that in a minute or two Granny would be able to catch him, that he understood that Granny was anything but crazy, and really was teaching him a new trick as well as trying to catch a dinner. When he realized this, he should have been ashamed of himself for doubting the smartness of Granny, and for thinking that he knew all there was to know. But he was too much excited for any such thoughts. Nearer and nearer to the shore came Quacker, his eyes fixed on the red, whirling form of Granny. Reddy's own eyes gleamed with excitement. Would Quacker keep on right up to the shore? Nearer and nearer and nearer he came. Reddy squirmed uneasily. He couldn't see as well as he wanted to. The bushes behind which he was lying were in his way. He wanted to see Granny make that jump, which would mean a dinner for both. Forgetting what Granny had charged him, Reddy eagerly raised his head up to look over the edge of the bank. Now, it just happened that at that very minute Quacker chanced to look that way. His quick eyes caught the movement of Reddy's head, and in an instant all his curiosity vanished. That sharp face peering at him over the edge of the bank could mean but one thing: danger. It was all a trick. He saw through it now. Like a flash he turned. There was the whistle of stiff wings beating the air and the patter of feet striking the water as he got under way. Then he flew out to the safety of the open water. Granny sprang, but she was just too late, and succeeded in doing no more than wet her feet. Of course, Granny didn't know what had frightened Quacker. Not at first, anyway. But she had her suspicions. She turned and looked up at the place where Reddy had been hiding. She couldn't see him. Then she bounded up the bank. There was no Reddy there, but far away across the snow-covered Green Meadows was a red dot growing smaller and smaller. Reddy was running away. Then she knew. At first, Granny was very angry. You know, it is a dreadful thing to be hungry and have a good dinner disappear just as it is almost within reach. "I'll teach that young scamp a lesson he won't soon forget when I get home," she muttered as she watched him. Then she went back to the edge of the big river, and there she found a dead fish which had been washed ashore. It was a very good fish, and when she had eaten it, Granny felt better. "Anyway," thought she, "I have taught him a new trick, and one he isn't likely to forget. He knows now that Granny still knows a few tricks that he doesn't, and next time he won't feel so sure he knows it all. I guess it was worth while, even if I didn't catch Quacker. My, but he would have tasted good." Granny smacked her lips and started for home. But Reddy, with a guilty conscience, was afraid to go home. And so, miserable and hungry, he hunted through the Green Forest all the night long, and wished that he had heeded what old Granny Fox had told him. The wisest folks make mistakes, but if they are truly wise, they will profit from them. There is a saying among the little people of the Green Forest and the Green Meadows which runs something like this: "You must your eyes wide open keep to catch old Granny Fox asleep." Of course, this means that old Granny Fox is so smart, so clever, so keenly on the watch at all times, that he must be very smart indeed who fools her or gets ahead of her. Reddy Fox is smart, very smart. But Reddy isn't nearly as smart as old Granny Fox. You see, he hasn't lived nearly as long, so of course there is much knowledge of many things stored away in Granny's head of which Reddy knows little. But once in a while even the smartest people are caught napping. Yes, sir, that does happen. They will be careless sometimes. It was just so with Granny Fox. With all her smartness and cleverness and wisdom, she grew careless. And all the smartness and cleverness and wisdom in the world is useless if the possessor becomes careless. You see, old Granny Fox had become so used to thinking that she was smarter than anyone else, unless it was Old Man Coyote, that she actually believed that no one was smart enough ever to surprise her. Yes, sir, she actually believed that. Now you know, when a person reaches the point of thinking that no one else in the great world is quite so smart, that person is like Peter Rabbit, when he made ready one winter day to jump out on the smooth ice of the Smiling Pool, getting ready for a fall. It was this way with old Granny Fox. Because she had lived near Farmer Brown's so long and had been hunted so often by Farmer Brown's boy and by Bowser the Hound, she had got the idea in her head that no matter what she did, they would not be able to catch her. So at last she grew careless. Yes, sir, she grew careless. And that is something no fox or anybody else can afford to do. Now, on the edge of the Green Forest was a warm, sunny knoll, which, as you know, is a sort of little hill. It overlooked the Green Meadows and was quite the most pleasant and comfortable place for a sun nap that ever was. At least, that is what old Granny Fox thought. She took sun naps there very often. It was her favorite resting place. When Bowser the Hound had found her trail and chased her until she was tired of running and had quite all the exercise she needed or wanted, she would play one of her clever tricks by which to make Bowser lose her trail. Then she would hurry straight to that knoll to rest and grin at her own smartness. It happened that she did this one day when there was fresh snow on the ground. Of course, every time she put a foot down, she left a print in the snow. And where she curled up in the sun, she left the print of her body. They were very plain to see, were these prints, and Farmer Brown's boy saw them. He had been tramping through the Green Forest late in the afternoon, and just by chance happened across Granny's footprints. Just for fun, he followed them, and so came to the sunny knoll. Granny had left some time before, but of course she couldn't take the print of her body with her. That remained in the snow, and Farmer Brown's boy saw it and knew instantly what it meant. He grinned, and could Granny Fox have seen that grin, she would have been uncomfortable. You see, he knew that he had found the place where Granny was in the habit of taking a sun nap. "So," said he, "this is the place where you rest, old Mrs. Fox, after running Bowser almost off his feet. I think we will give you a surprise one of these days. Yes, indeed, I think we will give you a surprise. You have fooled us many times, and now it is our turn." The next day Farmer Brown's boy shouldered his terrible gun and sent Bowser the Hound to hunt for the trail of old Granny Fox. It wasn't long before Bowser's great voice told all the Great World that he had found Granny's tracks. Farmer Brown's boy grinned just as he had the day before. Then, with his terrible gun, he went over to the Green Forest and hid under some pine boughs right on the edge of that sunny knoll. He waited patiently a long, long time. He heard Bowser's great voice growing more and more excited as he followed old Granny Fox. By and by, Bowser stopped baying and began to yelp impatiently. Farmer Brown's boy knew exactly what that meant. It meant that Granny had played one of her smart tricks, and Bowser had lost her trail. A few minutes later, out of the Green Forest came old Granny Fox, and she was grinning, for once more she had fooled Bowser the Hound, and now could take a nap in peace. Still grinning, she turned around 2 or 3 times to make herself comfortable, and then, with a sigh of contentment, curled up for a sun nap, and in a few minutes was asleep. And just a little way off, behind the pine boughs, sat Farmer Brown's boy, holding his terrible gun and grinning. At last he had caught old Granny Fox napping. Nothing ever simply happens, bear that point in mind. If you look long and hard enough, a cause you'll always find. Old Granny Fox was dreaming. Yes, sir, she was dreaming. There she lay, curled up on the sunny little knoll on the edge of the Green Forest, fast asleep and dreaming. It was a very pleasant and very comfortable place indeed. You see, jolly round bright Mr. Sun poured his warmest rays right down there from the blue, blue sky. When old Granny Fox was tired, she often slipped over there for a short nap and sun bath, even in the winter. She was quite sure that no one knew anything about it. It was one of her secrets. This morning, old Granny Fox was very tired, unusually so. In the first place, she had been out hunting all night. Then, before she could reach home, Bowser the Hound had found her tracks and started to follow them. Of course, it wouldn't have done to go home then. It wouldn't have done at all. Bowser would have followed her straight there and so found out where she lived. So she had led Bowser far away across the Green Meadows and through the Green Forest, and finally played one of her smart tricks which had so mixed her tracks that Bowser could no longer follow them. While he had sniffed and snuffed and snuffed and sniffed with that wonderful nose of his, trying to find out where she had gone, old Granny Fox had trotted straight to the sunny knoll and there curled up to rest. Right away, she fell asleep. Now, old Granny Fox, like most of the other little people of the Green Forest and the Green Meadows, sleeps with her ears wide open. Her eyes may be closed, but not her ears. Those are always on guard, even when she is asleep, and at the least sound, open fly her eyes and she is ready to run. If it were not for the way her sharp ears keep guard, she wouldn't dare take naps in the open, right in broad daylight. If you ever want to catch a fox asleep, you mustn't make the teeniest, weeniest noise. Just remember that. Now old Granny Fox had no sooner closed her eyes than she began to dream. At first it was a very pleasant dream, the pleasantest dream a fox can have. It was of a chicken dinner, all the chicken she could eat. Granny certainly enjoyed that dream. It made her smack her lips quite as if it were a real and not a dream dinner she was enjoying. But presently the dream changed and became a bad dream. Yes, indeed, it became a bad dream. It was as bad as at first it had been good. It seemed to Granny that Bowser the Hound had become very smart, smarter than she had ever known him to be before. To do what she would, she couldn't fool him. Not one of all her tricks she knew, and she knew a great many, fooled him at all. They didn't puzzle him long enough for her to get her breath. Bowser kept getting nearer and nearer and nearer, all in the dream, you know, until it seemed as if his great voice sounded right at her very heels. She was so tired that it seemed to her that she couldn't run another step. It was a very, very real dream. You know, dreams sometimes do seem very real indeed. This was the way it was with the bad dream of old Granny Fox. It seemed to her that she could feel the breath of Bowser the Hound, and that his great jaws were just going to close on her and shake her to death. "Oh, oh!" cried Granny, and waked herself up. Her eyes flew open. Then she gave a great sigh of relief as she realized that her terrible fright was only a bad dream, and that she was curled up right on the dear, familiar old sunny knoll, and not running for her life at all. Old Granny Fox smiled to think what a fright she had had. And then, well, she didn't know whether she was really awake or still dreaming. No, sir, she didn't. For a full minute she couldn't be sure whether what she saw was real or part of that dreadful dream. You see, she was staring into the face of Farmer Brown's boy and the muzzle of his dreadful gun. For just a few seconds she didn't move. She couldn't. She was too frightened to move. Then she knew what she saw was real and not a dream at all. There wasn't the least bit of doubt about it. That was Farmer Brown's boy, and that was his dreadful gun. All in a flash, she knew that Farmer Brown's boy must have been hiding behind those pine boughs. Poor old Granny Fox! For once in her life she had been caught napping. She hadn't the least hope in the world. Farmer Brown's boy had only to fire that dreadful gun, and that would be the end of her. She knew it. In time of danger, heed this rule. Think hard and fast, but pray keep cool. Poor old Granny Fox! She had thought that she had been in tight places before, but never, never had she been in such a tight place as this. There stood Farmer Brown's boy, looking along the barrel of his dreadful gun straight at her, and only such a short distance, such a very short distance away. It wasn't the least bit of use to run. Granny knew that. That dreadful gun would go bang, and that would be the end of her. For a few seconds she stared at Farmer Brown's boy, too frightened to move or even think. Then she began to wonder why that dreadful gun didn't go off. What was Farmer Brown's boy waiting for? She got to her feet. She was sure that the first step would be her last, yet she couldn't stay there. How could Farmer Brown's boy do such a dreadful thing? Somehow his freckled face didn't look cruel. He was even beginning to grin. That must be because he had caught her napping, and knew that this time She couldn't possibly get away from him, as she had so many times before. "Oh!" sobbed old Granny Fox under her breath. And right at that very instant, Farmer Brown's boy did something. What do you think it was? No, he didn't shoot her. He didn't fire his dreadful gun. What do you think he did do? Why, he threw a snowball at old Granny Fox and shouted, "Boo!" That is what he did, and all he did, except to laugh as Granny gave a great leap and then made those black legs of hers fly as never before. Every instant Granny expected to hear that dreadful gun, and it seemed as if her heart would burst with fright as she ran, thinking each jump would be the last one. But the dreadful gun didn't bang. And after a little, when she felt she was safe, she turned to look back over her shoulder. Farmer Brown's boy was standing right where she had last seen him, and he was laughing harder than ever. Yes, sir, he was laughing, and though old Granny Fox didn't think so at the time, his laugh was good to hear, for it was good-natured and merry, and all that an honest laugh should be. "Go it, Granny, go it!" shouted Farmer Brown's boy. "And the next time you are tempted to steal my chickens, just remember that I caught you napping and let you off when I might have shot you. Just remember that, and leave my chickens alone." Now it happened that Tommy Tit the Chickadee had seen all that had happened, and he fairly bubbled over with joy. "A-dee-dee-dee, Chickadee! It is just as I have always said. Farmer Brown's boy isn't bad. He'd be friends with everyone if everyone would let him," he cried. "Maybe, maybe," grumbled Sammy Jay, who had also seen all that had happened. "But he's altogether too smart for me to trust. Oh my, what news this will be to tell! Old Granny Fox will never hear the end of it. If ever again she boasts of how smart she is, all we will have to do will be to remind her of the time Farmer Brown's boy caught her napping. Ho, 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 ho! I must hurry along and find my cousin, Blacky the Crow. This will tickle him half to death." As for old Granny Fox, she feared Farmer Brown's boy more than ever, not because of what he had done to her, but because of what he had not done. You see, nothing could make her believe that he wanted to be her friend. She thought he had let her get away just to show her that he was smarter than she. Instead of thankfulness, hate and fear filled Granny's heart. You know, people who themselves do ill, for others seldom have good will. Though you may think another wrong and be quite positive you're right, don't let your temper get away, and try at least to be polite. Sammy Jay hurried through the Green Forest, chuckling as he flew. Sammy was brimming over with the news he had to tell, how old Granny Fox had been caught napping by Farmer Brown's boy. Sammy wouldn't have believed it if anyone had told him. No, sir, he wouldn't. But he had seen it with his own eyes, and it tickled him almost to pieces to think that old Granny Fox, whom everybody thought so sly and clever and smart, had been caught actually asleep by the very one of whom she was most afraid, but at whom she always had turned up her nose. Presently Sammy spied Reddy Fox trotting along the Lone Little Path. Reddy was forever boasting of how smart Granny Fox was. He had boasted of it so much that everybody was sick of hearing him. When he saw Reddy trotting along the Lone Little Path, Sammy chuckled harder than ever. He hid in a thick hemlock tree, and as Reddy passed, he shouted, "Had I such a stupid old granny, as some folks who think they are smart, I never would boast of my granny, but live by myself quite apart." Reddy looked up angrily. He couldn't see Sammy Jay, but he knew Sammy's voice. There is no mistaking that. Everybody knows the voice of Sammy Jay. Of course, it was foolish, very foolish of Reddy to be angry, and still more foolish to show that he was angry. Had he stopped a minute to think, he would have known that Sammy was saying such a mean, provoking thing just to make him angry, and that the angrier he became, the better pleased Sammy Jay would be. But like a great many people, Reddy allowed his temper to get the better of his common sense. "Who says Granny Fox is stupid?" he snarled. "I do," replied Sammy Jay promptly. "I say she is stupid. She is smarter than anybody else in all the Green Forest and on all the Green Meadows. She is smarter than anybody else in all the Great World," boasted Reddy, and he really believed it. "She isn't smart enough to fool Farmer Brown's boy," taunted Sammy. "What's that? Who says so? Has anything happened to Granny Fox?" Reddy forgot his anger in a sudden great fear. Could Granny have been shot by Farmer Brown's boy? "Nothing much, only Farmer Brown's boy caught her napping in broad daylight," replied Sammy, and chuckled so that Reddy heard him. "I don't believe it," snapped Reddy. "I don't believe a word of it. Nobody ever yet caught old Granny Fox napping, and nobody ever will." "I don't care whether you believe it or not. It's so, for I saw him," retorted Sammy Jay. You," began Reddy Fox. "Go ask Tommy Tit the Chickadee if it isn't true. He saw him too," interrupted Sammy Jay. "A-dee-dee-dee, Chickadee! It's so, and Farmer Brown's boy only threw a snowball at her and let her run away without shooting at her," declared a new voice. There sat Tommy Tit himself. Reddy didn't know what to think or say. He just couldn't believe it, and yet he had never known Tommy Tit to tell an untruth. Sammy Jay alone he wouldn't have believed. Then Tommy Tit and Sammy Jay told Reddy all about what they had seen, how Farmer Brown's boy had surprised old Granny Fox and then allowed her to go unharmed. Reddy had to believe it. If Tommy Tit said it was so, it must be so. Reddy Fox started off to hunt up old Granny Fox and ask her about it. But a sudden thought popped into his red head, and he changed his mind. "I won't say a thing about it until sometime when Granny scolds me for being careless," muttered Reddy with a sly grin. "Then I'll see what she has to say. I guess she won't scold me so much after this." Reddy grinned more than ever, which wasn't a bit nice of him. Instead of being sorry that old Granny Fox had had such a fright, he was planning how he could get even with her when she should scold him for his own carelessness. A saucy tongue is dangerous to possess. Be sure some day 'twill get you in a mess. Reddy Fox is headstrong and, like most headstrong people, is given to thinking that his way is the best way, just because it is his way. He is smart, is Reddy Fox. Yes, indeed, Reddy Fox is very, very smart. He has to be in order to live. But a great deal of what he knows he learned from old Granny Fox. The very best tricks he knows she taught him. She began teaching him when he was so little that he tumbled over his own feet. It was she who taught him how to hunt, that it is better never to steal chickens near home, but to go a long way off for them, and how to fool Bowser the Hound. It was Granny who taught Reddy how to use his little black nose to follow the tracks of careless young rabbits, and how to catch meadow mice under the snow. In fact, there is little Reddy knows which he didn't learn from wise, shrewd old Granny Fox. But as he grew bigger and bigger, until he was quite as big as Granny herself, he forgot what he owed to her. He grew to have a very good opinion of himself, and to feel that he knew just about all there was to know. So sometimes, when he had done foolish or careless things, and Granny scolded him, telling him he was big enough and old enough to know better, he would sulk and go off muttering to himself. But he never quite dared to be openly disrespectful to Granny, and this, of course, was quite as it should have been. "If only I could catch Granny doing something foolish or careless," he would say to himself. But he never could, and he had begun to think that he never would. But now, at last, Granny, clever old Granny Fox, had been careless. She had allowed Farmer Brown's boy to catch her napping. Reddy did wish he had been there to see it himself. But anyway, he had been told about it, and he made up his mind that the next time Granny said anything sharp to him about his carelessness, he would have something to say back. Yes, sir, Reddy Fox was deliberately planning to answer back, which, as you know, is always disrespectful to one's elders. At last the chance came. Reddy did a thing no truly wise fox will ever do. He went 2 nights in succession to the same henhouse, and the second time he barely escaped being shot. Old Granny Fox found out about it. How she found out, Reddy doesn't know to this day, but find out she did, and she gave him such a scolding as even her sharp tongue had seldom given him. "You are the stupidest fox I ever heard of," scolded Granny. "I'm no more stupid than you are," retorted Reddy in the most impudent way. "What's that?" demanded Granny. "What's that you said?" "I said I'm no more stupid than you are, and what is more, I hope I'm not so stupid. I know better than to take a nap in broad daylight right under the very nose of Farmer Brown's boy." Reddy grinned in the most impudent way as he said this. Granny's eyes snapped. Then things happened. Reddy was cuffed this way and cuffed that way and cuffed the other way until it seemed to him that the air was full of black paws, every one of which landed on his head or face with a sting that made him whimper and put his tail between his legs and finally howl. "There!" cried Granny, when at last she had to stop because she was quite out of breath. "Perhaps that will teach you to be respectful to your elders. I was careless and stupid, and I am perfectly ready to admit it, because it has taught me a lesson. Wisdom often is gained through mistakes, but never when one is not willing to admit the mistakes. No fox lives long who makes the same mistake twice, and those who are impudent to their elders come to no good end. I've got a fat goose hidden away for dinner, but you will get none of it." I wish I'd never heard of Granny's mistake," whined Reddy to himself, as he crept dinnerless to bed. "You ought to wish that you hadn't been impudent," whispered a small voice down inside him. The joys and the sunshine that make us glad, the worries and troubles that make us sad, must come to an end, so why complain of too little sun or too much rain? The thing to do is to make the most of the sunshine while it lasts, and when it rains, to look forward to the coming of the sun again, knowing that come it surely will. A dreadful storm was keeping the little people of the Green Forest, the Green Meadows, and the Old Orchard prisoners in their own homes, or in such places of shelter as they had been able to find. But it couldn't last forever, and they knew it. Knowing this was all that kept some of them alive. You see, they were starving. Yes, sir, they were starving. You and I would be very hungry indeed, if we had to go without food for 2 whole days. But if we were snug and warm, it wouldn't do us any real harm. With the little wild friends, especially the little feathered folks, it is a very different matter. You see, they are naturally so active that they have to fill their stomachs very often in order to supply their little bodies with heat and energy. So, when their food supply is wholly cut off, they starve, or else freeze to death in a very short time. A great many little lives are ended this way in every long, hard winter storm. It was late in the afternoon of the second day when rough Brother North Wind decided that he had shown his strength and fierceness long enough, and, rumbling and grumbling, retired from the Green Meadows and the Green Forest, blowing the snow clouds away with him. For just a little while, before it was time for him to go to bed behind the Purple Hills, jolly round red Mr. Sun smiled down on the white land. And never was his smile more welcome. Out from their shelters hurried all the little prisoners, for they must make the most of the short time before the coming of the cold night. Little Tommy Tit the Chickadee was so weak that he could hardly fly, and he shook with chills. He made straight for the apple tree, where Farmer Brown's boy always keeps a piece of suet tied to a branch for Tommy and his friends. Drummer the Woodpecker was there before him. Now, it is one of the laws of politeness among the feathered folk that when one is eating from a piece of suet, a newcomer shall await his turn. "A-dee-dee-dee," said Tommy Tit, faintly but cheerfully, for he couldn't be other than cheery if he tried. "A-dee-dee-dee, that looks good to me." "It is good," mumbled Drummer, pecking away at the suet greedily. "Come on, Tommy Tit. Don't wait for me, for I won't be through for a long time. I'm nearly starved, and I guess you must be." "I am," confessed Tommy as he flew over beside Drummer. "Thank you ever so much for not making me wait."
"Don't mention it," replied Drummer with his mouth full. "This is no time for politeness. Here comes Yank Yank the nuthatch. I guess there is room for him too."
Yank Yank was promptly invited to join them, and did so after apologizing for seeming so greedy. "If I couldn't get my stomach full before night, I certainly should freeze to death before morning," said he. "What a blessing it is to have all this good food waiting for us! If I had to hunt for my usual food on the trees, I certainly should have to give up and die. It took all my strength to get over here. My, I feel like a new bird already. Here comes Sammy Jay. I wonder if he will try to drive us away as he usually does." Sammy did nothing of the kind. He was very meek and most polite. "Can you make room for a starving fellow to get a bite?" he asked. "I wouldn't ask it, but that I couldn't last another night without food." "A-dee-dee-dee, always room for one more," replied Tommy Tit, crowding over to give Sammy room. "Wasn't that a dreadful storm?" "Worst I ever knew," mumbled Sammy. "I wonder if I ever will be warm again." Until their stomachs were full, not another word was said. Meanwhile, Chatterer the Red Squirrel had discovered that the storm was over. As he floundered through the snow to another apple tree, he saw Tommy Tit and his friends, and in his heart he rejoiced that they had found food waiting for them. His own troubles were at an end, for in the tree he was headed for was a store of corn. Old Mother Nature's plans for good quite often are not understood. Tommy Tit and Drummer the Woodpecker and Yank Yank the Nuthatch and Sammy Jay and Chatterer the Red Squirrel were not the only ones who were out and about as soon as the great storm ended. Oh, my, no. No, indeed. Everybody who was not sleeping the winter away, or who not had a store of food right at hand, was out. But not all were so fortunate as Tommy Tit and his friends in finding a good meal. Peter Rabbit and Mrs. Peter came out of the hole in the heart of the dear Old Briar-patch, where they had managed to keep comfortably warm, and at once began to fill their stomachs with bark from young trees and tender tips of twigs. It was very coarse food, but it would take away that empty feeling. Mrs. Grouse burst out of the snow and hurried to get a meal before dark. She had no time to be particular, and so she ate spruce buds. They were very bitter and not much to her liking, but she was too hungry, and night was too near for her to be fussy. She was thankful to have that much. Granny Fox and Reddy were out too. They didn't need to hurry because, as you know, they could hunt all night, but they were so hungry that they just had to be looking for something to eat. They knew, of course, that everybody else would be out, and they hoped that some of these little people would be so weak that they could easily be caught. That seems like a dreadful hope, doesn't it? But one of the first laws of Old Mother Nature is self-preservation. That means to save your own life first. So perhaps Granny and Reddy are not to be blamed for hoping that some of their neighbors might be caught easily because of the great storm. They were very hungry indeed, and they could not eat bark like Peter Rabbit, or buds like Mrs. Grouse, or seeds like Whitefoot the Wood Mouse. Their teeth and stomachs are not made for such food. It was hard going for Granny and Reddy Fox. The snow was soft and deep in many places, and they had to keep pretty close to those places where rough Brother North Wind had blown away enough of the snow to make walking fairly easy. They soon found that their hope that they would find some of their neighbors too weak to escape was quite in vain. When jolly round red Mr. Sun dropped down behind the Purple Hills to go to bed, their stomachs were quite as empty as when they had started out. "We'll go down to the Old Briar-patch. I don't believe it will be of much use, but you never can tell until you try. Peter Rabbit may take it into his silly head to come outside," said Granny, leading the way. When they reached the dear Old Briar-patch, they found that Peter was not outside. In fact, peering between the brambles and bushes, they could see his little brown form bobbing about as he hunted for tender bark. He had already made little paths along which he could hop easily. Peter saw them almost as soon as they saw him. "Hard times these," said Peter pleasantly. "I hope your stomachs are not as empty as mine." He pulled a strip of bark from a young tree and began to chew it. This was more than Reddy could stand. To see Peter eating while his own stomach was just one big ache from emptiness was too much. "I'm going in there and catch him, or drive him out where you can catch him, if I tear my coat all to pieces," snarled Reddy. Peter stopped chewing and sat up. "Come right along, Reddy. Come right along if you want to, but I would advise you to save your skin and your coat," said he. Reddy's only reply was a snarl as he pushed his way under the brambles. He yelped as they tore his coat and scratched his face, but he kept on. Now, Peter's paths are very cunningly made. He had cut them through the very thickest of the briars, just big enough for himself and Mrs. Peter to hop along comfortably. But Reddy is so much bigger that he had to force his way through, and in places crawl flat on his stomach, which was very slow work, to say nothing of the painful scratches from the briars. It was no trouble at all for Peter to keep out of his way, and before long Reddy gave up. Without a word, Granny Fox led the way to the Green Forest. They would try to find where Mrs. Grouse was sleeping under the snow. But though they hunted all night, they failed to find her, for she wisely had gone to bed in a spruce tree. Who will not admit he is older each day fools no one but himself. Old Granny Fox is a spry old lady for her age. If you don't believe it, just try to catch her. But spry as she isn't as spry as she used to be. No, sir, Granny Fox isn't as spry as she used to be. The truth is, Granny is getting old. She would never admit it, and Reddy never had realized it until the day after the great storm. All that night they had hunted in vain for something to eat, and at daylight had crept into their house to rest a while before starting on another hunt. They had neither the strength nor the courage to search any longer then. Wading through snow is very hard work at best, and very tiresome. But when your stomach has been empty for so long that you almost begin to wonder what food tastes like, it becomes harder work still. You see, it is food that makes strength, and lack of food takes away strength. This is why Granny and Reddy just had to rest. Hungry as they were, they had to give up for a while. Reddy flung himself down, and if ever there was a discouraged young fox, he was that one. "I wish I were dead," he moaned. "Tut, tut, tut," said Granny Fox sharply. "That's no way for a young fox to talk. I'm ashamed of you. I am indeed." Then she added more kindly, "I know just how you feel. Just try to forget your empty stomach and rest a while. We have had a tiresome, disappointing, discouraging night, but when you are rested, things will not look quite so bad. You know the old saying, 'Never a road so long is there but it reaches a turn at last. Never a cloud that gathers swift but disappears as fast.' You think you couldn't possibly feel any worse than you do right now, but you could. Many a time I have had to go hungry longer than this. After we have rested a while, we will go over to the old pasture. Perhaps we will have better luck there." So Reddy tried to forget the emptiness of his stomach and actually had a nap, for he was very, very tired. When he awoke, he felt better. "Well, Granny," said he, "let's start for the old pasture. The snow has crusted over, and we won't find it such hard going as it was last night." Granny arose and followed Reddy out to the doorstep. She walked stiffly. The truth is, she ached in every one of her old bones. At least, that is the way it seemed to her. She looked towards the old pasture. It seemed very far away. She sighed wearily. "I don't believe I'll go, Reddy," said she. "You run along, and luck go with you." Reddy turned and stared at Granny suspiciously. You know his is a very suspicious nature. Could it be that Granny had some secret plan of her own to get a meal and wanted to get rid of him? "What's the matter with you?" he demanded roughly. "It was you who proposed going over to the old pasture." Granny smiled. It was a sad sort of smile. She is wonderfully sharp and smart, is Granny Fox, and she knew what was in Reddy's mind as well as if he had told her. "Old bones don't rest and recover as quickly as young bones, and I just don't feel equal to going over there now," said she. "The truth is, Reddy, I am growing old. I am going to stay right here and rest. Perhaps then I'll feel able to go hunting tonight. You trot along now, and if you get more than a stomachful, just remember old Granny and bring her a bite." There was something in the way Granny spoke that told Reddy she was speaking the truth. It was the very first time she had ever admitted that she was growing old, and was no longer the equal of any fox. Never before had he noticed how gray she had grown. Reddy felt a kind of shame creep over him. Shame that he had suspected Granny of playing a sharp trick. And this little feeling of shame was followed instantly by a splendid thought. He would go out and find food of some kind, and he would bring it straight back to Granny. He had been taken care of by Granny when he was little, and now he would repay Granny for all she had done for him by taking care of her in her old age. "Go back in the house and lie down, Granny," said he kindly. "I am going to get something, and whatever it may be, you shall have your share." With this, he trotted off towards the old pasture, and somehow he didn't mind the ache in his stomach as he had before. There's nothing so foolishly silly and vain as to wish for a thing you can never attain. We all know that, yet most of us are just foolish enough to make such a wish now and then. I guess you have done it. I know I have. Peter Rabbit has done it often, and then laughed at himself afterwards. I suspect that even shrewd, clever old Granny Fox has been guilty of it more than once. So it is not surprising that Reddy Fox, terribly hungry as he was, should do a little foolish wishing. When he left home to go to the old pasture, in the hope that he would be able to find something to eat there, he started off bravely. It was cold, very cold indeed, but his fur coat kept him warm as long as he was moving. The Green Meadows were glistening white with snow. All the world, at least all that part of it with which Reddy was acquainted, was white. It was beautiful, very beautiful, as millions of sparkles flashed in the sun. But Reddy had no thought for beauty. The only thought he had room for was to get something to put in the empty stomachs of himself and Granny Fox. Jack Frost had hardened the snow so that Reddy no longer had to wade through it. He could run on the crust now without breaking through. This made it much easier, so he trotted along swiftly. He had intended to go straight to the old pasture, but there suddenly popped into his head a memory of the shelter down in a far corner of the old orchard which Farmer Brown's boy had built for Bob White. Probably the Bob White family were there now, and he might surprise them. He would go there first. Reddy stopped and looked carefully to make sure that Farmer Brown's boy and Bowser the Hound were nowhere in sight. Then he ran swiftly towards the old orchard. Just as he entered it, he heard a merry voice just over his head. Dee 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 dee. Reddy stopped and looked up. There was Tommy Tit the Chickadee, clinging tightly to a big piece of fresh suet tied fast to a branch of a tree, and Tommy was stuffing himself. Reddy sat down right underneath that suet and looked up longingly. The sight of it made his mouth water so that it was almost more than he could stand. He jumped once. He jumped twice. He jumped 3 times. But all his jumping was in vain. That suet was beyond his reach. There was no possible way of reaching it save by flying or climbing. Reddy's tongue hung out of his mouth with longing. "I wish I could climb," said Reddy. But he couldn't climb, and all the wishing in the world wouldn't enable him to, as he very well knew. So after a little he started on. As he drew near the far corner of the old orchard, he saw Bob White and Mrs. Bob and all the young Bobs picking up grain, which Farmer Brown's boy had scattered for them just in front of the shelter he had built for them. Reddy crouched down, and very slowly, an inch at a time, he crept forward, his eyes shining with eagerness. Just as he was almost within springing distance, Bob White gave a signal, and away flew the Bob Whites to the safety of a hemlock tree on the edge of the Green Forest. Tears of rage and disappointment welled up in Reddy's eyes. "I wish I could fly," he muttered as he watched the brown birds disappear in the big hemlock tree. This was quite as foolish a wish as the other, so Reddy trotted on and decided to go down past the Smiling Pool. When he got there, he found it, as he expected, frozen over. But just where the Laughing Brook joins it, there was a little place where there was open water. Billy Mink was on the ice at its edge, and just as Reddy got there, Billy dived in. A minute later, he climbed out with a fish in his mouth. "Give me a bite," begged Reddy. "Catch your own fish," retorted Billy Mink. "I have to work hard enough for what I get as it is." Reddy was afraid to go on the ice where Billy was, so he sat and watched him eat that fine fish. Then Billy dived into the water again and disappeared. Reddy waited a long time, but Billy did not return. "I wish I could dive," gulped Reddy, thinking of the fine fish somewhere under the ice. And this wish was quite as foolish as the other wishes. "'Tis not the foes that are without, but those that are within, that give us battles that we find the hardest are to win." After the last of his 3 foolish wishes, Reddy Fox left the Smiling Pool and headed straight for the old orchard, for which he had started in the first place. He wished now that he had gone straight there. Then he wouldn't have seen the suet tied out of reach to the branch of a tree in the old orchard. He wouldn't have seen the Bob Whites fly away to safety just as he felt almost sure of catching one. He wouldn't have seen Billy Mink bring a fine fish out of the water and eat it right before him. It is bad enough to be starving with no food in sight, but to be as hungry as Reddy Fox was, and to see food just out of reach, to smell it and not be able to get it is, well, it is more than most folks can stand patiently. So Reddy Fox was grumbling to himself as he hurried to the old pasture, and his heart was very bitter. It seemed to him that everything was against him. His neighbors had food, but he had none, not so much as a crumb. It was unfair. Old Mother Nature was unjust. If he could climb, he could get food. If he could fly, he could get food. If he could dive, he could get food. But he could neither climb, fly, nor dive. He didn't stop to think that Old Mother Nature had given him some of the sharpest wits in all the Green Forest, or on all the Green Meadows. that she had given him a wonderful nose, that she had given him the keenest of ears, that she had given him speed excelled by few. He forgot these things, and was so busy thinking bitterly of the things he didn't have, that he forgot to use his wits, and nose, and ears, when he reached the Old Pasture. The result was that he trotted right past Old Jed Thumper, the big gray rabbit, who was sitting behind a little bush holding his breath. The minute Old Jed saw that Reddy was safely past, he started for his bull-briar castle as fast as he could. It was not until then that Reddy discovered him. Of course, Reddy started after him, and this time he made good use of his speed. But he was too late. Old Jed Thumper reached his castle with Reddy 2 jumps behind him. Reddy knew now that there was no chance to catch Old Jed that day, and for a few minutes he felt more bitter than ever. Then, all in a flash, Reddy Fox became the shrewd, clever fellow that he really is. He grinned. "It's of no use to try to fill an empty stomach on wishes," said he. "If I had come straight here and minded my own business, I'd have caught Old Jed Thumper. Now I'm going to get some food, and I'm not going home until I do." Very wisely, Reddy put all unpleasant thoughts out of his head, and settled down to using his wits and his eyes and his ears and his nose for all they were worth, as Old Mother Nature had intended he should. All through the Old Pasture he hunted, taking care not to miss a single place where there was the least chance of finding food. But it was all in vain. Reddy gulped down his disappointment. "Now for the Big River," said he, and started off bravely. When he reached the edge of the Big River, he hurried along the bank until he reached a place where the water seldom freezes. As he had hoped, he found that it was not frozen at all. It looked so black and cold that it made him shiver just to see it. Back and forth with his nose to the ground he ran. Suddenly he stopped and sniffed. Then he sniffed again. Then he followed his nose straight to the very edge of the Big River. There, floating in the black water, was a dead fish. By wading in, he could get it. Reddy shivered at the touch of the cold water, but what were wet feet compared with such an empty stomach as his? In a minute he had that fish and was back on the shore. It wasn't a very big fish, but it would stop the ache in his stomach until he could get something more. With a sigh of pure happiness, he sank his teeth into it, and then, well, then he remembered poor old Granny Fox. Reddy swallowed a mouthful and tried to forget Granny, but he couldn't. He swallowed another mouthful. Poor old Granny was back there at home, as hungry as he was, and too stiff and tired to hunt. Reddy choked. Then he began a battle with himself. His stomach demanded that fish. If he ate it, no one would be the wiser. But Granny needed it even more than he did. For a long time Reddy fought with himself. In the end, he picked up the fish and started for home.